Edward III, England's greatest king, the untold rise of King Edward III. Thunder crashed over Windsor, and the boy who would one day shake the thrones of Europe let out his first cry. But how did a child born under lightning become the king who humbled the Scots, battered the French, invented the Order of the Garter, and faced down a plague that killed half of Europe? Before he wore the crown, young Edward III lived in a world of betrayal, power plays, and royal family drama worthy of a medieval soap opera. His father, Edward II, loved his male favorites more than his kingdom, earning the hatred of nobles and the chilling nickname, the Foolish King. Meanwhile, his mother, Queen Isabella, beautiful, cunning, and French, was plotting something dark from behind courtly smiles. Why did she earn the name the She-Wolf of France? What pushed her to flee to her homeland, only to return at the head of an army, dragging her 12-year-old son with her like a chess piece across the channel? What secret pact did a teenage Edward sign on the back of a marriage contract that would forever change the destiny of England and end one king's life in the most mysterious and gruesome way imaginable? This is not your average medieval history. This is a saga of thunderous births, royal affairs, French escapes, teenage diplomacy, and one of the most dramatic revolutions in British royal history. And just when the dust settles, a boy king picks up the sword and goes to war. From the slaughter fields of Halidon Hill to the naval chaos of Sluys where the sea turned red, to the moment longbows laughed at charging knights, this is the legend of the boy who became a monarch, a warrior, and a legend. How did Edward survive betrayal, rebellion, and Black Death to become England's greatest king? What was the real story behind the Order of the Garter and his Knights of Glory? Strap in, because what follows is a royal tale of chaos, crowns, and cunning that even Game of Thrones wouldn't dare to write. It was a cold, windswept day, 13 November 1312 to be precise, when England's future golden boy, Edward III, came wailing into the world at Windsor Castle, nestled in the county of Berkshire. And oh, what a celebration it was! Not just because royal babies tend to prompt feasts and fireworks, but because this one was legit. A proper, crown-wearing, throne-inheriting baby born of King Edward II and Queen Isabella of France, the she-wolf herself. You see, Edward II had been king for 5 years at this point, but his fatherhood record was complicated. Sure, he had a son before, Adam Fitzroy, born around 1307, but Adam had a rather inconvenient issue for royal ambitions. He was illegitimate. No marriage, no crown, no dice. So, when Isabella delivered a bona fide heir, there was jubilation in the realm. Trumpets blared, monks prayed, and a few nobles likely wept with relief. Finally, a baby that can stop this monarchy from careening off a cliff. Now let's meet Papa Edward II, the man who frankly makes Henry VIII look like a competent statesman. Edward II succeeded his iron-fisted father, Edward I, in 1307. Now Edward I was a tough act to follow. He was known as Longshanks, a towering figure who had conquered Wales, beaten up the Scots temporarily, reformed the judiciary, and centralized England until it practically screamed for breath. Think of him as the medieval CEO who turned the ragtag kingdom into a lean, mean, bureaucratic machine. His son, though, less CEO, more CEO's artsy nephew who inherited the company. Whereas Longshanks ruled with fists of iron and laws of steel, Edward II ruled with emotion. And a best friend named Piers Gaveston. This young Gascon nobleman wasn't just close to Edward, he was intimate. Whether the relationship was romantic is still debated, but what's not up for debate is Edward's wild favoritism. Upon becoming king, Edward handed Gaveston titles, lands, and the kind of authority usually reserved for war-hardened dukes. Gaveston was soon Earl of Cornwall, and in the eyes of the nobility, a royal parasite with no pedigree. The nobles were furious. "Who does this upstart think he is?" they grumbled as Gaveston strutted about in silks, giving cheeky nicknames to barons like a teenage gossip columnist. Eventually, tensions snapped, and Gaveston was exiled, and then brought back, and then exiled again. And then hunted down and killed in 1312 by none other than Thomas of Lancaster and the Earl of Warwick, just months before Edward III was born. Talk about awkward baby shower conversations. Now let's talk about Edward III's mother, Isabella of France, born in 1295 to Philip IV of France, a man so ruthless he bullied the Pope and crushed the Knights Templar. Isabella was married to Edward II in 1308 at the tender age of 12 because, well, royal diplomacy didn't care for adolescents. But Isabella was no naive princess. Raised in the politically charged court of Paris, she understood alliances, power, and treachery better than most grown men. And by the 1320s, she had grown tired of being sidelined by her husband's latest favorite, Hugh Despenser, a man whose ambition made Gaveston look humble. As Edward III babbled in his cradle, England was cracking. 1314, the Battle of Bannockburn saw Robert the Bruce and the Scots deliver a devastating humiliation to the English. Longshank's Scottish conquests, gone in a couple days of Highland fury. Bruce's men outflanked and destroyed the English cavalry, while Edward II reportedly fled the battlefield like a toddler after a thunderclap. 1315 to 1317. Enter the Great Famine. Crops failed. Livestock died, people starved, bread became a luxury, and grain riots broke out. The peasants were not happy campers. Meanwhile, Hugh Despenser the Younger, Edward II's new obsession, began amassing lands, titles, and enemies. By 1321, civil war erupted, led once again by Thomas of Lancaster. The man really didn't know when to quit. Lancaster failed and was executed in 1322, but peace didn't follow. Now Despenser was running the show. He had Edward II in one hand and the country's wealth in the other. Everyone else? Boiling with rage, including the Queen. Back in the royal nursery, young Edward III was raised in a separate household, independent of his parents, a common practice, but in this case, it may also have been a way to shield him from the political chaos engulfing the court. Strangely, he was never named Prince of Wales, the customary title for the heir to the throne. Instead, he was Earl of Chester. As he grew, so did the royal family. John of Eltham, born 1316, Eleanor, born 1318, Joan, born 1321. His education was not a monkish affair. Edward learned to read and write in English and French, struggled with Latin, and may have picked up bits of Flemish and German, but his true training? War. Horsemanship. Combat. He was bred to be a warrior king. Thank goodness, because he was going to need those skills soon. By the mid-1320s, Queen Isabella had had enough. Hugh Despenser's grip on her husband and the country was choking the court. And then came the perfect opportunity. France. For centuries, the kings of England had held land in France, first from the Norman conquest, then as Dukes of Aquitaine. The problem? That land was part of the French kingdom, which meant Edward II technically owed homage to the French king. And now the French king just so happened to be Isabella's brother, Charles IV. In 1323, a diplomatic snafu in Aquitaine ended with a French official hanged. Charles IV was enraged and invaded the duchy. Edward II panicked, and Despenser's idea of damage control was arresting the Queen for being French. Brilliant. But Charles IV wasn't having it. He sent word to Edward, release my sister, or else. Oh, and maybe let her come negotiate peace, for your sake. In a move so baffling it makes you wonder what was in the king's wine, Edward agreed, and Isabella was shipped off to France in 1325, ostensibly as a peacemaker. Queen Isabella of France, elegant, sharp-minded, and thoroughly fed up, found herself stuck in a miserable marriage with Edward II, a king who seemed far more interested in lavishing wealth and power on his favorites, the Despenser family, than in ruling England or loving his queen. Hugh Despenser the Younger, in particular, had Edward's ear, heart, and royal purse strings. Things got so bad for Isabella that she was insulted, financially cut off, and essentially imprisoned by her own husband. So what does a queen do in the face of royal neglect and political humiliation? She fled to France, ostensibly on a diplomatic mission, but in truth it was the greatest "I'm going to my mother's house" revenge tour in medieval history. And there in France she met a man. A tall, rebellious, smoldering outlaw of a man. Roger Mortimer, once a noble, now an escaped traitor living in exile. Together, they made the perfect pair. He had the brawn and brains, she had the legitimacy and fury. And very quickly, Mortimer was no longer just a political ally. He became Isabella's partner in revolution, and everything else. Back in England, Edward II was facing pressure to patch things up with his brother-in-law, Charles IV of France. Trouble was, as Duke of Aquitaine, Edward was technically Charles's vassal. That meant homage, kneeling, bowing, and Edward was simply too proud or too petty to do that. So, what's a desperate king to do? He sent his 12-year-old son, Prince Edward, the future Edward III, in his place to pay homage. Yes, a child, sent into a pit of vipers with a polite diplomatic smile. This bizarre workaround didn't just confuse everyone, it backfired epically. Because now Isabella and Mortimer had something priceless, a legitimate royal figurehead around whom they could rally the exiled English nobles. A boy of royal blood, a future king. And conveniently, Isabella's own son. When Edward II demanded his son back, Isabella flatly said, no, and we imagine Mortimer in the background doing the medieval version of the mic drop. With England beginning to bubble with discontent and Edward II increasingly isolated, Isabella knew it was time to strike. But she needed an army, and you don't find those in Paris cafes, so she turned to Count William of Hainault, a powerful lord near the modern-day Belgium border. In exchange for a few hundred troops, she promised that young Prince Edward would marry his daughter, Philippa. What better way to sweeten the pot than a royal wedding? With a small but lethal force of around 700 well-equipped troops, Isabella, Mortimer, and young Edward set sail for England in late September 1326, ready to take back the kingdom. Once Isabella and Mortimer landed in Suffolk, everything moved with stunning speed. It was like England had been waiting for this moment. Years of resentment against Edward II, his favoritism toward the Despensers, his failed leadership, his outright neglect, boiled over. City after city turned against the king. London declared for Isabella and Prince Edward. The Despensers were hunted down, captured, and swiftly executed, their deaths brutal, public, and deeply satisfying for their many enemies. In November, Edward II was cornered in South Wales, arrested, and dragged to Kenilworth Castle. And so, on the 13th of January 1327, Parliament made its move. Edward II was to be deposed. When this was brought to him, the king wept. Whether from humiliation, fear, or the loss of his Despensers, no one could say. But he abdicated on the 20th of January. 5 days later, Edward III, aged just 14, was proclaimed King of England, Lord of Ireland, and Duke of Aquitaine. He was crowned at Westminster Abbey in a celebration fit for a king, though in truth, he was a puppet. The real rulers? Isabella the Queen Mother and her not-so-secret lover, Roger Mortimer. Officially, Edward III was meant to rule with a balanced council of bishops, earls, and barons. Unofficially, Isabella and Mortimer ignored them completely and ruled as a two-person dictatorship in royal disguise. But what to do with the old king? Edward II was a living threat. Whispers of his rescue echoed through the halls of power. So, in September 1327, a quiet order was given. One dark night at Berkeley Castle, Edward II was discreetly murdered, allegedly with a red-hot poker to the rear, although that may be pure medieval tabloid. Either way, he died. The problem of the old king was solved, but the seeds of rebellion were not yet finished sprouting. Barely crowned, the young Edward III faced his first war. In 1327, Robert the Bruce of Scotland, sensing England's turmoil, sent James Douglas and a raiding party of 10,000 fierce Scots into northern England. Isabella and Mortimer saw an opportunity. A military victory would legitimize their power, so they and Edward led an army north. What followed was a frustrating game of cat and mouse, now called the Weardale Campaign. Eventually, the armies faced off near the River Wear for 3 tense days. Then, on the night of August 3rd, the Scots launched a daring raid, slicing into the royal camp. They nearly captured King Edward, a 14-year-old boy surrounded by chaos and battle cries. Though he escaped unharmed, Edward would never forget that night. As if England's drama wasn't enough, France joined the party. On the 1st of February 1328, King Charles IV of France, Isabella's brother, died without a male heir. By law, the throne couldn't go to a woman, so Isabella herself was out. But her son, Edward III, grandson of Philip IV, had a strong claim, too strong in fact. The French nobility shuddered at the idea of an English king ruling France, so they chose Philip of Valois, a distant cousin, who was quickly crowned Philip VI. Edward, who now saw himself as a rightful French king snubbed by a mere count, began to burn with ambition. The events of these years, the betrayal of Edward II, the rise of Edward III, the meddling of France were not isolated storms. They were the beginning of the greatest dynastic conflict in medieval Europe. Let us begin in the spring of 1328, a time when the world was still reeling from the latest royal family drama, courtesy of Isabella of France and her dashing but dastardly lover, Roger Mortimer. Having overthrown Edward II with a mix of military might and sheer gall, the power duo were now basically running England like a medieval episode of House of Cards, with young Edward, barely into his teens, playing the role of a crown-wearing prop. But not everyone was buying it. In the lull between Philip VI's succession and his coronation in May 1328, a very serious and very French deputation arrived in Paris, bearing a formal protest from Isabella and Mortimer. Their demand? That Edward III should inherit the French throne. After all, his mother was the sister of the recently deceased Charles IV, and by the laws of logic, read, desperate grasping at royal legitimacy, that should make Edward the rightful king of France. Right? Wrong. The French snorted in unison. Absolutely not, they said, probably with a baguette in one hand and a disdainful shrug in the other. French succession law followed Salic law, which barred inheritance through the female line. No matter how hard Isabella waved her royal blood around, Edward was not getting the throne. Not even a ceremonial crown made of stale cheese. Thus began one of history's longest and bloodiest family squabbles, the 100 Years' War, though nobody knew it at the time. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Fast forward to spring 1329. Edward, now a 16-year-old, with the hairstyle of a rock god and the temper of a cornered lion, had to play nice. He crossed the Channel to France, and in the Grand Amiens Cathedral, knelt before Philip VI, paying homage to him as his feudal lord, as Duke of Aquitaine. On the surface it looked like all was well. Edward bowed, Philip accepted, all smiles. But behind those smiles, swords were being sharpened. This was not the end. It was just the calm before the war-drenched storm. Let's rewind briefly to 1327, when young Edward was married by proxy, yes, by proxy, to Philippa of Hainault. Why? Because Count William of Hainault, her daddy dearest, had helped Isabella and Mortimer overthrow Edward II. And like all good medieval business deals, this one came with a marriage clause. Edward, then 14, had absolutely no say in the matter. He was still learning how to hold a sword without poking someone's eye out. But by 1329, he was less inclined to let his mum and Mortimer run the kingdom like their personal playground. He was growing teeth and sharpening them. That same year, whispers began to flow through the cold, damp corridors of royal politics. Edward's allies, loyal nobles and men of ambition, sent secret messages to the papacy in Avignon, the other Vatican. These messages weren't love letters. They were coded cries for help. The king, they said, is being muzzled. Edward may have worn the crown, but Mortimer pulled the strings, and it didn't sit well with everyone, least of all, Edward himself. Then came 1330. By now, tensions were tighter than a lute string. Rumors spread like wildfire, and oh, these weren't just any rumors. The juiciest of them all, that Isabella was pregnant with Mortimer's child. You could practically hear the gasps echo through the castles of England. This wasn't just a scandal, it was a dynastic threat. Mortimer was still married to Joan of Geneville, his poor sidelined wife of nearly 30 years. The plot, it seemed, was to divorce Joan, marry Isabella, and place their child on the throne. That was enough for Edward. In October 1330, the boy became the man. On the night of October 19th, just weeks before his 18th birthday, Edward and his loyal confidant William Montagu crept through secret passages beneath Nottingham Castle. What followed could only be described as a Game of Thrones season finale. They burst into Mortimer and Isabella's chambers. Swords were drawn. A scuffle broke out. Attendants screamed, a few died. Mortimer was arrested, dragged from Isabella's side like a common criminal. The next day, Edward stood tall and declared to the realm, "I now rule alone." Mortimer was hauled off to London, charged with a laundry list of crimes, tyranny, corruption, and general villainy. No trial, no plea bargain, just a date with destiny at Tyburn, where he was hanged like a common thief on November 29, 30. He was the first political execution at Tyburn, a sight that would later see many more. As for Isabella, Edward spared his mother, but her reign of influence was over. She was shipped off to Windsor Castle, likely in shock, suffering a nervous collapse. By 1332, she was relocated to Castle Rising, where she lived like a pampered prisoner, expensive gowns, religious musings, and zero political power. She never quite forgave her son, and he never quite forgave her. While all this royal chaos brewed in England and France, another cauldron was bubbling to the north. Scotland had signed the Treaty of Northampton in 1328, agreeing to let some English border lords keep lands in southern Scotland. Spoiler, they didn't. Robert the Bruce died in 1329 and his toddler son, David II, took the throne. The Scottish regents ignored English claims and the angry English lords became known as the Disinherited. The Bruce dynasty had recently delivered a punch to English pride in the form of Bannockburn, 1314, but now the winds were changing. The Bruce's heir, David II, was just a child, and Edward III saw his chance. He dusted off an old Scottish claimant, the puppet king Edward Balliol, a man whose main talent was losing thrones, and together they decided to invade Scotland to restore order, which in medieval terms meant grab land, flatten opposition, and install your favorite guy on the throne. So Edward III marched north in 1333, bringing with him an army of fewer than 10,000 men. That's right, less than a football stadium's worth of soldiers were about to go up against a massive Scottish army twice their size. Why the small numbers? Simple. Campaigning was expensive. England was still licking its wounds from civil strife, and medieval recruitment posters weren't exactly persuasive. Join now, get cold, muddy, and maybe die. Meanwhile, the Scots, bless their brave hearts, sent the formidable Sir Archibald, the grim Douglas, charging south with around 20,000 men. His goal? Break Edward's siege of Berwick-upon-Tweed, the most hotly contested town in all of Britain. Berwick was the prize, the glittering, fortified jewel of the borderlands. Lose it, and Scotland lost its face. Save it, and they could claim another Bruce-style victory. But Edward had a plan so simple, it would make a Roman proud. Sit on the high ground and dare the Scots to come up. Halidon Hill wasn't just any hill. It was a tall, steep, muddy, soul-sapping death trap just northwest of Berwick. Edward set up his forces there like a smug landlord on the upper floor watching burglars try to climb up his greased stairs. He positioned his archers in wide chevron formations nestled between groups of infantry. At the heart of this setup was England's not-so-secret weapon, the 6-foot longbow, lovingly strung with the kind of tension that could rip a man's soul in half. These longbows could fire 10 to 12 arrows per minute, faster than you could say, Douglas is doomed. And still, Douglas charged. He had no choice. Berwick's defenders had given an ultimatum. If the Scottish army didn't arrive to relieve them by July 20th, the town would surrender. Douglas could have waited, flanked, or starved out the English, but that damned deadline forced his hand. So up the hill they came. It was midday when the skies darkened, not from clouds, but from thousands of iron-tipped arrows slicing through the air. Imagine thunder that punctures your mail armor. The Scottish soldiers, brave as lions, marched up Halidon Hill like fish swimming straight into a bear's mouth. Wave after wave they came, and wave after wave was mowed down before they ever reached English lines. The hill became slick with blood and rain. Panic set in. The Scottish formations, once proud and thunderous, broke apart like soggy bread. Edward then gave the signal. The English soldiers charged downhill, their blood up, their morale high, and their swords hungry. The Scots, in full retreat, were cut down mercilessly. Some tried to flee to the sea. Many drowned. More were butchered. By sunset, over 10,000 Scots lay dead, including Douglas himself and 5 Scottish earls. It was a massacre, not a battle. Edward hadn't just won, he had annihilated his opponents. In the aftermath of the carnage, Berwick had no reason to resist anymore. The town surrendered, and Edward III stood atop Halidon Hill like a teenage war god, holding a longbow and a grudge. The victory was so complete, so chilling, it sent shockwaves across Europe. Back in Scotland, Edward Balliol was reinstalled on the throne like a very confused cat returned to its owner. In February 1334, he agreed to surrender 8 entire counties, the entire southern belt of Scotland, to Edward III. In June, he even paid homage to Edward in Newcastle, declaring him overlord. It was the medieval equivalent of shouting, "You da boss, man." Meanwhile, little David II, the real heir, packed his royal bags and fled to France with his advisors, seeking safety under the wing of the Auld Alliance. But Balliol, oh Balliol. If there were a medieval Olympics for losing kingdoms, he'd win gold every time. The very moment Edward turned his back, Balliol sparked another revolt by being, well, Balliol. Within months, he was booted again. Edward had to return, again and again. He campaigned into the Highlands by 1336, leaving English flags fluttering all over Scottish castles, but the resistance just kept bubbling like a witch's cauldron. The North was a cold, stubborn mistress that refused to be tamed, and just as Edward was preparing to squeeze Scotland even tighter, another storm blew in, this time from France. In 1328, the French King Charles IV died without a male heir, ending the Capetian dynasty. Edward, through his mother Isabella, daughter of the dead king, had a strong claim to the French throne. But the French nobility, no fans of Englishmen in Paris, chose Philip VI of Valois instead. Edward had grudgingly paid homage to Philip in 1329. But now, he was older, he was bolder, and he had just crushed an army twice his size. Confidence was high, France was ripe. And thus in 1337 the 100 Years' War began, a conflict born from royal snubs, feudal ego, and one epic case of, "You stole my throne." Ah yes, the Auld Alliance. It wasn't some cozy dinner party pact. It was a centuries-long military agreement between Scotland and France to always gang up on England. If England invaded one, the other would strike. This alliance was older than your grandma's cheese wheel, first signed in 1295, and it explains exactly why David II fled to France after Halidon Hill. France was Scotland's eternal partner in petty. By 1334, Edward had done what few kings before him had achieved. He practically conquered Scotland in just 18 months. Berwick was his. The southern counties were his. Balliol bowed to him, and the Scots were in chaos. Had France not called, Edward may very well have finished the job, maybe even brought Scotland under permanent English rule. But the lure of a greater crown, the French crown, was too great. He turned his gaze across the Channel. As Edward III sharpened his sword and gazed northward to subdue Scotland once and for all, the French King Philip III sat in his Parisian palace, sipping wine and muttering, "Not on my watch, Eddie." Like a classic international meddler, Philip threw his full weight behind young David II of Scotland, the teenage king who had more claim to a comic book than a crown. By 1336, things got so heated that France was actually planning a grand invasion of Scotland. Oh yes, an armada was supposedly ready to launch, perhaps to be greeted in Edinburgh by bagpipes and rain. But Edward had a solution, and it wasn't diplomacy, it was arson. He torched Scotland's coastal farms, villages, crops, anything remotely edible. His logic? If the French come, they'll starve. Strategic Cruelty 101. With the menu in Scotland reduced to ash and soot, the French cancelled the invasion. One can only imagine the look on Philip's face. No foie gras? Zoodalors! Now, if you think Edward was done beefing with France, think again. The big slap came in 1337 when Philip VI announced, with the subtlety of a guillotine, "I'm taking Aquitaine. Deal with it." That was no small land grab. Aquitaine was Edward's continental jewel, a piece of France ruled by England for generations. The Count of Eu was sent to invade Gascony and ruin the countryside. While Bordeaux stood defiant, the message was clear. France wasn't just provoking, it was coming for everything. And thus began the 100 Years' War, which is really a series of wars, peace deals, betrayals, and egos large enough to fill Versailles. Edward's grand strategy? Recycle what worked in Scotland. Burn, loot, and terrify civilians into surrender. Except this wasn't the Highlands, this was France, where the peasants weren't intimidated, they were furious. Instead of weakening the enemy's morale, Edward's brutality only inspired loyalty to Philip VI. And he wasn't exactly winning hearts and minds. Worse, transporting large armies across the Channel wasn't like booking a ferry. Ships were small, winds were unreliable, and crossing with thousands of troops meant weeks of praying and puking overboard. Logistics were Edward's Achilles' heel. So Edward did what any cash-strapped monarch with war dreams would do: call rich cousins in Europe. In 1337, he sent the Bishop of Lincoln and his mate William Montagu, now Earl of Salisbury, to Germany and the Low Countries, knocking on royal doors like medieval Jehovah's Witnesses. Miraculously, it worked. Alliances were signed with Brabant, Hainault, and even Louis of Bavaria, the Holy Roman Emperor himself. In return, Edward promised enough gold to drown a dragon. Nearly £124,000 was promised by the end of 1337, multiple times the English crown's annual income. Two Italian bankers who lent Edward money with interest rates that made everyone sweat. And just like that, England had a 20,000-man army ready to roll into France. But this came with a price: taxes. Parliament was roped in, and they agreed to fund Edward's fantasy in exchange for influence. Ironically, Edward's war hunger helped plant the seeds of English constitutionalism. Edward sailed with 5,000 troops on July 16, 1338, passing through Antwerp like a conquering Caesar. In Koblenz, he met Louis of Bavaria, who crowned him Vicar General of the Holy Roman Empire, a title which sounded powerful, but meant Edward now had more hats than armies. Still, Philip VI avoided direct battle like a shifty poker player. A brief encounter at La Capelle in 1339 ended in nothing. Edward was furious, and when kings get angry they do stupid things, like declare themselves King of France. That's right. In January 1340, with the help of Flemish power broker Jacob van Artevelde, Edward resurrected a bold old claim. I, Edward III, am the rightful King of France. He added the French lilies to his coat of arms like a kid adding stickers to a trophy. Flashy, symbolic, and deeply provocative. With France's fleet growing and Castilian ships adding to the count, the Channel was looking less like water and more like an arena. Edward built up England's navy to about 150 ships, still outnumbered by Philip's 200. Then came Midsummer's Day, June 24, 1340. Off the coast of Flanders, the English caught the French ships in tight formation, perfect for a slaughter. English longbowmen let fly from ship decks, thousands of arrows cutting through sails, flesh, and chaos. By nightfall, 18,000 Frenchmen were dead or drowning. Only 23 French ships survived. Edward himself fought in the melee and caught an arrow in the thigh. But that didn't matter. He had done the unthinkable, wiped out France's fleet in a day. It was a stunning, game-changing victory. England now ruled the Channel. But as always, war's greatest enemy isn't the sword. It's the ledger. By late 1340, Edward slinked back to England in disguise, furious at his ministers for letting the treasury fall into chaos. Archbishop of Canterbury John Stratford wasn't thrilled to see him. Think passive-aggressive bishop with a bone to pick. By 1341, peace of sorts returned. But guess who also made a comeback? David II of Scotland. Now older, bolder, and more Scottish than ever, David returned from France and snatched up Edinburgh and Stirling like a teenager raiding the pantry. Edward, still wearing a bandage from slice, was forced to refocus north again, dragging his war-weary troops back to the Anglo-Scottish border for winter campaigns. But don't worry, France wasn't done with him yet. Edward III versus everyone, the cheeky conqueror of Crécy and Calais. Chapter 1. A Duke Drops Dead and the Vultures Circle. It was April 1341, and all was not well in the breezy northwest corner of France. The Duke of Brittany, John III, kicked the medieval bucket, dead as a doornail, and without a child to his name. A duchy without an heir in 14th century France was like meat dropped in a lion's den. Every ambitious prince, cousin, and king was suddenly very, very interested. Into the power vacuum stepped John de Montfort, nephew of the late Duke. Not exactly first in line, but hey, this was medieval politics. Lineage was just a suggestion if you had the right friends. And boy did he have the right friend. Edward III of England, who had been itching to prove he had more right to the French throne than Philip VI, the reigning French king and self-proclaimed party pooper. Philip VI, ever eager to say non to Edward, threw his royal weight behind Charles of Blois, another noble who claimed the duchy through his wife, a proper medieval love triangle of land and blood. This kicked off the War of the Breton Succession, a sideshow in the 100 Years' War that would last 25 years. That's a whole generation of chaos, backstabbing, and Frenchmen yelling, "Sacre bleu!" Edward's motive? To stir the pot. This was the perfect opportunity to test whether his claim to the French crown was real power or just royal hot air. By 1345, Edward had had enough of subtlety. He started assembling a major invasion force in England. But like all good medieval campaigns, the details were wrapped tighter than a nun's corset. Even the English nobility didn't know exactly what the king was planning. Was he going to challenge Paris? Support his Breton buddy? Or just burn the French countryside for sport? Spoiler alert, it was all of the above. By July 1346, Edward set sail with 12,000 to 15,000 men and landed dramatically on the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy. His mission? A chevauchée, a fast-moving, scorched-earth raid to terrorize the French countryside. He would devastate villages, sack towns, burn crops, and live rent-free in the heads of French nobles. Edward wasn't just fighting, he was redefining war. No drawn-out sieges or duels of honor. This was war on wheels. The English plundered with gusto, and the French couldn't keep up. On July 26th, Edward seized the wealthy city of Sens, Normandy's gem, and for 5 glorious chaotic days, the English treated it like a Black Friday sale with swords. Meanwhile, Edward's eyes were already drifting to Paris, now lying dangerously exposed. But the English king wasn't ready to walk straight into a royal meat grinder. Instead, he veered north, toward the friendly arms of his Low Country allies, hoping to regroup. But King Philip VI of France wasn't about to let Edward party uninvited. He gathered a massive army, over 20,000 men, to crush the English invaders. The chase was on. August 26, 1346. Near the village of Crécy-en-Ponthieu, the two kings finally faced off. Edward had the high ground, literally and figuratively. On the right bank of the River Mai, he planted his flag and arranged his men in 3 groups, dismounted knights in the center and longbowmen on either flank, ready to unleash medieval hellfire. The French charged, wave after wave, confident, arrogant, and oh so doomed. Their elite crossbowmen, once feared across Europe, barely got their shots off before being shredded by the faster, deadlier English longbows. Then came the French cavalry, galloping uphill like they were charging into glory. Instead, they charged into death by arrows. It was Halidon Hill 2.0, the sequel nobody in France asked for. By dawn the next day, 4,000 French troops lay dead. Edward's losses? Mere hundreds. Philip VI barely escaped, probably cursing the longbow as England's new secret weapon. Oh, and did we mention? Edward had a few cannons, the first use of artillery in Western Europe. Just a few clunky boomsticks, but enough to make Crécy the battle that changed warfare forever. With northern France defenseless and French pride bleeding out, Edward turned his army toward Calais, the vital port city hugging the English Channel. On September 1346, he began the siege that would last nearly a year. It was brutal. Starvation, disease, psychological warfare, Edward used it all. Finally, on August 3, 1347, Calais surrendered. And Edward? He claimed it like a man who had just scored beachfront property for the next 211 years. Calais would be England's last stronghold in France, not lost until 1558. Back home, Edward's enemies weren't done giving him gifts. Philip VI, humiliated in France, nudged David II of Scotland to invade northern England while Edward was away. David obliged, marching south with 12,000 men, convinced he'd find England empty. Instead, he found Lord Ralph Neville and a ragtag English army, about half the size of David's force, waiting at Neville's Cross on October 17, 1346. The result? Carnage. Around 2,000 killed and David II himself captured, possibly muttering traitor at every English peasant he saw for the next 11 years in prison. By late 1347, Edward III was the medieval version of a rock star. He had smashed the French, captured a Scottish king, and held Calais as a trophy. France was rattled. Scotland was leaderless. England was drunk on victory. So Edward did what every great conqueror does. He declared a 9-month truce, strutted back across the Channel, and rode into London like a hero from legend. Back in 1344, Edward had begun constructing a grand hall at Windsor Castle. Not just any hall, but a headquarters for what he envisioned as his very own round table. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, he wanted to play medieval cosplay with the best of the realm, dressing them in plate armor, swearing oaths, and likely arguing about who gets to sit next to Sir Lancelot. But now, with Europe half conquered and the treasury jingling with war plunder, he decided, to hell with pretending. Let's make this real. And so was born the Order of the Garter, a knightly cult of glory, chivalry, and a rather peculiar fashion accessory, a garter belt. Yes, you read that right. Legend says it all began at a court ball. A woman, possibly the Countess of Salisbury, was dancing with grace and nobility when, oh horror, her garter fell to the floor. Courtiers began to snicker like high-born schoolchildren, but Edward, ever the gallant king, lifted the garter and declared, Honi soit qui mal y pense. Shame on him who thinks evil of it. Boom. Just like that, a scandal became a symbol of chivalry. Was it a defense of honor or a royal flirt gone dramatic? We'll never know. But one thing is sure, the garter became the symbol of England's most elite knightly order, and the king had just knighted chivalry with lingerie. Mind you, this tale doesn't appear in written form until the 1460s, over a century after the event, so it's likely more legend than lace. But who doesn't love a good scandal? When Edward assembled his new Holy Fellowship of Warriors in 1348, it wasn't just for show. He picked 25 knights, most of whom were battle-tested, blood-soaked veterans of France and Scotland. You've got names like Edward the Black Prince, his son and heir, a war machine in human form. Henry of Lancaster, Edward's cousin and a loyal hammer in the king's arsenal. Thomas de Beauchamp, Jean de Grailly, Ralph Stafford, William Montagu, and more. Basically, the Avengers, medieval edition. But there was one curious name on the list. Roger Mortimer, 2nd Earl of March. Yes, that Mortimer. The grandson of the notorious usurper who had ruled England with Queen Isabella and was eventually hanged like a common thief. His inclusion? Likely thanks to his bromance with the Black Prince. Nepotism? Maybe. Forgiveness? Perhaps. Political maneuvering? Absolutely. To house this order of glory, Edward went full medieval HGTV on Windsor Castle. The king wasn't just building a headquarters, he was building a statement. I am King Arthur reborn, and this is my Camelot. And it cost him nearly £50,000, which by medieval standards is the GDP of a small kingdom and a bucket of unicorn tears. It became the most expensive building project of any English monarch in the Middle Ages. Meanwhile, Edward also owned Woodstock Palace, where his son, the Black Prince, had been born. This place would later give way to Blenheim Palace, but back in 1348, it was another jewel in Edward's crown of estates. All was glowing. The kingdom was prosperous, victorious, and chivalrous. But just as Edward was planning his next great adventure, the end came crawling in, on the back of a flea. The year was 1348. Ships from the Crimea docked in European ports with their bellies full of rats. On those rats, fleas. And in those fleas, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that would be the headline act of the worst apocalypse since Noah. By summer, the Black Death had reached England's shores. The people had no idea what was coming. It began with fever, vomiting, chills. Then came the swellings, the buboes, grotesque lumps on the neck, armpits, groin. When they burst, gangrene spread, and soon, the victim was coughing up blood and making arrangements for an early grave. It was fast, brutal, and unstoppable. Edward's own daughter, Princess Joan, died of the plague in Bordeaux in the summer of 1348, before she could marry the Prince of Castile. Her death was a royal heartbreak, personal and public. When the plague began sweeping through London, Edward did what many modern leaders only dream of doing. He got the hell out. The king and his court fled to rural England, engaging in what we now call social distancing and quarantine, medieval style. Parliament cancelled, courts adjourned, graves mass dug. Sanitation measures were deployed, though basic, but by 14th century standards, England did fairly well. And shockingly, it worked, for a time. But while the disease burned through villages and cities alike, another crisis was brewing. Not one of blood or rats, but of coin and sweat. 1/3 of your kingdom dies, guess what happens? No one shows up to work. Fields went unharvested. Livestock wandered unattended. And peasants? They suddenly had leverage. With their numbers decimated, those who survived began demanding better wages. Why should I work for half a groat a week when my neighbor got buried yesterday? Edward, ever the strategist, said, not on my watch. In 1349, he issued the Ordinance of Laborers, and in 1351, the Statute of Laborers, a legal curb on wage inflation. It fixed pay at pre-plague levels, Employers couldn't outbid each other, and workers couldn't extort more money. It was both brilliant and brutal. The English economy stabilized, but resentment grew. The seeds of social unrest were planted. To enforce the new labor laws, Edward didn't turn to sheriffs or knights. He turned to the local gentry, creating a powerful class of legal enforcers, the justices of the peace. These were not just passive judges. They were active governors, enforcers, tax collectors, and policy watchdogs. Over time, they became a cornerstone of English governance, eventually spreading their legal tradition to America, India, and beyond. And it all began with rats, robes, and regulations in Plague-era England. So what did Edward III leave behind in this peculiar chapter of his reign? A legendary order of the Garter, born from gallantry or scandal. The mighty reconstruction of Windsor Castle, a monument to medieval statecraft. Survival during the Black Death through quick decisions and early quarantines. And the foundation of a regulated labor economy that saved England's productivity post-apocalypse.